friends, and welcome to another video. Before I wanted to start, I just wanted to show you, look how cautiously I'm putting down these first few brush strokes. Like, this is edited, right? I had another full minute of me trying to figure stuff out. Anyway, today I wanted to talk to you about light, which is a notoriously tricky subject to paint. And if I'm honest, I'm actually not that experienced with it either. This was a huge test for me. So rather than me telling you, all the tips and tricks and like anything I will say to you today, don't take them as fact. Take them more as, this is what I've experienced. This is how I went about doing it. And hopefully some of these tips may work for you. I had a hiccup with the camera. I promise you the light balance will get better. I've tried to edit it, it just wouldn't, it wouldn't fix itself. So don't worry, it's going to be back to normal in like a minute. Anyway, yeah, light. So today's subject is a mermaid floating in sunbeams, essentially. And sort of letting the sunbeams fall through their hand and sort of playing with the light, essentially. Which is, very tricky. It takes a lot of understanding of harsh lighting, especially since they're in a very dark, they're in dark water. So what I did, the way I started, was by blocking out which areas would be in the sunbeams and which areas would be in the dark water. And I put down some very faint sort of guidelines. And you can just about see them if you look closely enough. And then, based on that, that would help me block out basically where I was going to put, there we go, camera's fixed, where I was going to put the highlights and where I was going to put harsher shadows. Because the way light seems to work, to me anyway, from what I've observed and the limited knowledge I have, is that in very harsh lighting, your shadows become a lot harsher too. So the contrast is a lot higher. Whereas in an area of darkness, the contrast is a lot lower. Everything is dark and the shadows aren't as much darker from the non-shadowy bits, basically, if that makes sense. Hopefully it'll make more sense the further you get into the video. So based on that, I first tried to figure out where am I going to get my harshest lighting, where is it the brightest, and in those areas I would put down the harshest shadows. Sorry, this is very much a tongue twister. So you can see me trying to sort of slowly block out the bits and pieces where all the harsh lighting comes in, where the deepest shadows need to be. And you can see that right now I'm putting down some darker shadows in certain spots, whereas in other spots the shadow is quite sort of not as harsh, it's more sort of blended out, essentially. Now, another thing that very much helped me when working on this was the fact I was working with a very limited colour palette. I chose only two colours to work with here, and those are Phthalo green, so PG7, and Quin Violet, of which I've forgotten the pigment number right now, but I'll put it in the description. Which, funnily enough, actually sort of coincides with a limited colour palette challenge that someone else on YouTube here did, Arlie Bean, much better known than me. I very much love her channel, and I have taken on some of her attempts at limited colour palettes. I've used similar colours in some of my paintings, and I really enjoy doing it. So you'll see more of that on my channel, probably, maybe, possibly, yeah. But this particular colour palette was in fact a coincidence. It was chosen by a friend of mine at random, and it worked really well with the idea of a mermaid. So sort of that green skin, which reminds me a bit of the mermaids you see in Harry Potter. And then the red, or the violet, you'll find back in the hair. And together they balance each other out to a fantastic neutral grey. which really helps for, the contrast in light and dark. Anyway, by now in the painting, we're already moving on to the tail, and this is where I started having some issues because I was working on not cheap paper, it's just purely cotton paper, 200 GSM as well. It's my Hahnemühle sketchbook, which I really like, but it dries very quickly and the brush strokes stay very, very visible. So I had some issues with layering, with blending things out, as you can see. I also didn't use any tape to keep the lines straight. I'm very sorry if that bothers you. I don't use tape until the very end just to tape off the edges of the painting. But yeah. Another thing that I had a lot of issues with around the tail was the fact that I was working on something that was a 3D shape in a 2D image. So when you think about these beams of light coming into the water, they don't exist on a 2D sort of on a flat surface. They reach into the back, parts they're sort of cylindrical shaped possibly, so parts of them will light up different parts of the body. In general, you can create quite straight shapes, but it might be that half the tail is in darkness and some of it is in light, and that's working on a 2D background, in a 3D environment, but painting on a 2D surface, which is very, very hard, and I definitely did not do a perfect job on that. It broke my mind a little bit, so if the lighting around the tail seems a bit iffy and odd, there's only so much I can do. It's very hard. I hope you will forgive me. Anyway, now that you can see sort of how dark the shading on the tail got, I was starting to realise that, in fact, what I'd mostly been working towards right now was more of a contrast, not necessarily of light and dark, but of hue. So how vivid something was, and it really shows up in the hair in a second as well once I've painted the entire hair. So some of it is, rather than being lighter or darker, it's more vibrant or more muted than the rest. And that's something you also do observe in shadowy areas, is that the colour is not as punchy as it would be under harsh lighting, but it doesn't quite have the same effect as light and dark. It's not quite the same thing. So once the hair is finished, you'll see in a sec that really there was a lack of contrast still. So if I would have put that under a black and white picture, which I do like to take sometimes while I work, I take black and white photos of my work to see where it needs more contrast, you could see that all of it sort of had the same intensity, and it was different parts were not necessarily darker than others, they were just more muted in colour. So, in order to up that contrast, I went much, much deeper with the shading. What also helped was putting in, blocking in the darkness of the water around the mermaid. That really ups the contrast. If you're struggling with making something look really contrasted, it's usually about either making the highlights lighter, which can be tricky in watercolour, you usually have to add gouache, or making the darks darker, essentially. So that is one of the reasons why with watercolour they always tell you to try and preserve the white of your page, find spots that are really, really light, and use minimal colour or really diluted colour. But yeah, now the hair is really coming together. You can see that it all basically looks the same, just parts of it are a bit more grey. That's the mixture of the green and violet together. And it was just not doing it for me, so I went over it with a far darker mixture. And this is where the contrast really, really starts to step up his game. So yeah, you can, based on that, you can sort of tell there's lots of different aspects to when working with lighting, which make it such a tricky subject to paint. And it really takes a practiced eye, as well as just putting down notes of reference for yourself if you really struggle with this. So things that I've covered here, just to summarize, are hue versus brightness. These are two things that are both involved in working with light, but they are separate, and you need to remember that they are separate. As well as 3D shapes. The mermaid is a 3D shape with a tail that sort of reaches into a plane in the background, and that makes things a lot more tricky. So for me, it was really helpful to work with this limited palette because it meant that I could focus much more easily on just light versus dark and vibrancy versus versus mutedness. That just becomes all a lot easier when you work with very limited colours. It's a very good practice. And then, if I want to do something like this again, who knows, I might step it up and play with a more, expanded palette with more colours, and try and keep in mind that, those key fundamental basic bits of, light, dark, vibrancy, and mutedness of colour. Also, I messed up a little bit with some of the shading on the hand that reaches back. There is a bit of shade on it that's not really meant to be there. That just happened. Like I said, I'm not perfect at this subject. This is still very new to me as well, and um, yeah, some of it just is like that. It's not a perfect painting. There's brush strokes in it. There's little mishaps with the shading. It remains a tricky subject to paint, and this was for me very much an experiment of playing around with basically a random prompt given to me by a friend, and it was incredibly good practice, and I feel like I have stepped up my knowledge of art and of working with light. But obviously, as a first attempt at painting such harsh lighting on such a scale, as in a full figure, with such extreme darks and lights, I think it's a very good first attempt. But it is by no means perfect, and it's not meant to be. You can also see that while I kept areas on the body shadowed, I did go over them again with the colour of the water, because it just otherwise it makes it seem like they're too much of a cardboard cutout. So yeah, I had to go over it again just to make it look a bit more like the mermaid is in fact part of the environment. And as well, coming back to that sort of 3D effect, when light goes deeper into water, it obviously disperses, and uh, it, it doesn't penetrate all the way to the bottom of the sea, hence the bottom of the sea being really dark. So I tried to disperse it a little bit and have a sort of a gradient to it. You can see that the shapes are not perfectly, triangular or whatever as they go further down. I've added sort of a misty effect where it becomes a bit darker. I do bring up that darkness a bit further, like further up to the top right corner to really keep that effect. And because I bring it up further, it gives you more the illusion that we are in fact in water and it is an environment and it's not pure white light all the way through. So we kept the top right corner the very, very lightest, and it really helps incredibly well with the contrast. So of course you have to add a little bit more shade, like make it just a bit darker, see how far I could really amp up that contrast. Amp up that contrast. And try my best to sort of not let any you know, details get lost in the darkness as well, because that was something I was very scared of. But again, that's something that does happen in when you're working in dark areas. The contrast gets lost a bit, the details get lost a bit. So sometimes if that happens, maybe you might as well let it happen. It can happen. Like, it doesn't take away from the reality of the painting. Anyway, time to take the tape off and see the finished result. Personally, I am really, really proud of how this one turned out. Like, I am extremely happy. It wasn't easy, but it looks good. I'm pleased with it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little art video, and feel free to leave a like, a comment, or request any other ideas or paintings below. I love working with ideas of other people, and hopefully I will see you in the next video. Take care, everyone. Bye.